So, good day, everyone. We are Thailand Group 2, and today we'll be discussing a poem by Emily Dickens, which is entitled Fate is a Fine Intervention. So, Ivy will share us more about the poem. Ivy?
Okay, so The Fate is a Fine Invention is a poem by Emily Dickinson. She is an American poet known for her unique style and exploration of profound themes. The title itself is somewhat ironic, setting up an expectation that fate is something positive and valuable. However, Dickinson challenges this notion in the poem.
Okay. So, I suppose it's also good if we go through this poem per line. So, I'll probably let's try to run this through. Okay, so let's start off. Fate is a fine invention. I'll just read it to it. For gentlemen who see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. Okay, so the first line of the poem, fate is a fine invention. I think Ivy have something for this, no?
Yeah, the theme of the poem revolves around contrasting perspectives on fate and reason. Dickinson suggests that fate is a fine invention when one's mind is not able to grasp or understand something fully.
And I suppose it's also like a statement when we say fate is a fine invention, is that having faith or being a man of faith is an admirable thing, right? Because she describes this as a fine invention, meaning that it is a good quality to have for someone to have because it has its utility. So what about you, Miss Ate Feliz, about this first line? What do you think?
For first line, fate is a fine invention for gentlemen who see. I think it is kind of related to another metaphorical phrase, which means the eye is a beauty is in the eye of the beholder, rather. So, fate is a fine invention where those people who wants to see this specific fate invention is clear and seen it as a fine invention itself.
Okay. So those are really contrasting sentiments. So let's try to move on from that. Fate is a fine invention for gentlemen who see. So this is I'll try to start off with this one, right? So when we say for gentlemen who see, I suppose it relates to the previous statement. It's that people who are like curious or enthusiastic about learning, faith is a good quality to have. So I suppose it's just a connecting sentiment to the first line. So what about you, Ivy? What do you think?
About the when gentlemen can see, I suggest that faith is the most useful when one's reason and intellect fail to comprehend or when faced with uncertainty.
Ate Feliz.
Okay, so for gentlemen who see, as I have as what I've said earlier, I think my interpretation in this specific line is that someone who really wants to literally check and see the specific things and detailed things into a specific subject, which is not named here and just named here as fate. So for me, that's what's the meaning of for gentlemen who see.
Okay. So let's try to move on from that before we like get an entire interpretation in our head. So, but microscopes are prudent. Okay. So Ivy, why don't you start off with this one?
Okay, so for me, but microscopes are prudent implies that reason symbolized by microscope rather is more careful and practical. It suggests that relying on reason and evidence is a wiser approach.
What about the other Phillies?
For me, would like to actually interpret it if you would, if it would be okay, like including already the in an emergency, because I think it is connected by each other. So, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency, which is in these situations, this microscope is um, something that we don't need at all if we are of something that we just have a very shallow knowing. So, like prudent is like, if you define it, something that you do not put so much attention, right? So for me, be having this kind of informations is not something you want to in an emergency itself. So yeah.
Okay, okay. So I'll try to put in my sentiments. I'll also do what Ate Felice did. I'm sorry, Ate. But microscopes are prudent in an emergency. I think that relates to, although faith is a good quality to have, microscopes are a representation of microscopes, which is academic knowledge or like technical knowledge. Knowledge is important, especially when that type of knowledge is needed in the situation. So I suppose, let's say you're a doctor and you're also a man of faith. In an emergency, would you turn to? Would you turn to a religion? Would you turn to like a faith, your own faith? Or would you turn to your practice? Would you turn to like modern technologies? So I suppose the statement, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency, is more or less a counter statement to the first, because it says that it is also important to be someone who is knowledgeable in the real world, for
Mm-hmm.
someone to be also reliant in knowledge as well. So I suppose that's the entire last two statements. So before we like wrap this up with Ivy's entire like interpretation, let's try to like put forth our own like translation on this. So Ivy, what do you think of Emily Dickinson's "Fate is a Fine Invention"? Paul.
Okay, so overall, Dickinson seems to be challenging blind faith and suggesting that reason and evidence should guide one's belief. The poem is concise but through provoking, typical of Emily Dickinson styles, and it invites readers to reflect on the relationship between faith and reason.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I do. I'll also try to be next. So I also agree with that statement, because I think in this poem, Emily Dickinson recognizes the value of faith. You know, it's important to be someone who has like certain beliefs and values that they hold dear to themselves without prior proof, right? However, it is also important to acknowledge the importance of academic and general knowledge in our minds, because we cannot follow blind faith blindly, right? Faith cannot be followed blindly, because to do so is to fall off a cliff, they say, right? So I suppose Emily Dickinson also warns us about being victims of, or rather, being like mouthpieces for claims that we don't have proof on. So, Ate Feliz, what do you think?
I think for my overall interpretation, this both through lines, four lines rather, is kind of contrasting to each other, but connected in a way. Because if you think of it, fate is a fine invention for gentlemen who see. It is telling that you, each people has this specific beliefs and such in fate. Um, and in someone's perspective, it can be something that they don't see as a whole, but this specific perspective see it as a whole. But in contrast to the other one, which is very nice, wherein Emily Dickinson was able to stress out that even though you have different perspectives, in a specific situation, you will need to adjust at some point that this kind of faith and this kind of belief may be at some time will not be helpful for you at that specific situation. So
All
I
right.
guess that's
Right. So I do totally agree with that. They're really two contrasting statements. So Ivy, why don't you wrap this up? What do you think is like the underlying theme here? Like, What do you say?
I see. I think that if you have a specific emergency or context in mind, you want to provide more details for more tailored analysis. Or, however, it is essential to note that interpretation of poetry can be subjective, and different readers may find different meanings or perspective in the same work.
All right, right. So yeah, I do think that Emily Dickinson here warns us about like how we should like orient ourselves in the world. In a world filled with a lot of beliefs, a lot of value systems. One thing that we can all rely on as well is our minds. It's important to think for ourselves. No, so Ate Felice, you have like a conclusive statement for this. What do you have in mind, perhaps?
Um, Maybe to actually just stress how beautiful the poem, how it was something that can be very timeless because in this world, as you can see, we live in a different beliefs and such in faith, and it is timeless knowing that this will happen every time because we transfer our beliefs to different people, but the perspective that we have in mind where we can change and adjust would be timeless to people that we meet as well. So I guess that's my last statement for this poem.
Okay. Right. So thank you everyone for watching, and that's Fate is a Fine Invention by Emily Dickinson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.